you're a friend of Joel's.
And I'm a friend of Joel's.
Queens is getting cool.
And Ruth, do you want to introduce yourself?
And I'm the shortest grandmother in the world and the proudest mother today because Joel is here.
Aww.
And I'm going to listen to Mark carefully.
And on the panel, we have Mark, Joel, Sandy, myself, and I think we're each planning on talking for just a few minutes. Mark is the heart and soul behind this book, right? He, the only person in the world who could have grabbed us all to University of Regina, don't giggle. Only the Americans giggle, the Canadians say it straight face. So the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, Canada. But he gathered, the Brits are giggling. Anyway, Mark.
Well, thanks a lot, Michelle, for helping to get this going tonight and for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Graduate Center. I was joking earlier about the cover of the book. Maybe it's a dangerous cover in New York, I'm not sure, given the Big Apple.
It's not a critique of New York.
It's not a critique of New York.
No, our mayor's running for president. How could you critique us?
And you do so well, isn't it?
And he's going to do so well. Hello.
Essentially, ever since grad school, I've always had a reflexive unease about what we were valuing and what the information and the advice I was getting all the time about you got to get research grants and you got to publish papers and do that, doesn't matter. Don't join those committees. Don't do that work. That takes too long. Just do what counts. Never mind what matters. And I thought to myself, these people like me and they're giving me good advice. Why does it feel so wrong? What's wrong? And I didn't quite have the language in graduate school to understand. I just knew this is wrong. We're not making change. We're writing about wanting to change things, but not actually doing. And so that I carried that throughout my early days of getting a tenure track job, and I still thought this is wrong. What's happening? Why are we valuing this in such a way? And then I got to learn about audit culture and the way we value certain works over others and privilege certain knowledges over other knowledges, and started to read about neoliberalism and the sort of, the rearticulation and reconfiguration of 18th and 19th century liberalist arguments that market exchanges captures an essential and basic truth about human nature. And in such there's a goodness there, and I thought that's wrong. Got thinking about new public management, which most of our universities are now under the globe over, and new public management for me is and others is the adoption of private sector management practices, the introduction of market style incentives and disincentives, imposing a customer orientation coupled with consumer choice and branding, devolving budget functions while maintaining tight control through auditing and oversight, outsourcing labor with casual temporary staff, unbundling the private sector into units organized by product, and emphasizing greater output performance measures and controls. And the ironic part about this, as governments do this, as they impose more control over what's happening, it's usually concomitant with a drop in funding. So you create this Hunger Games kind of condition where we're in competition with each other, each institution. There are winners and losers, so you can't collaborate in the same way. That happens at the institutional level, and then if you get less funding, you're to blame because you didn't measure up according to these arbitrary metrics. So it's this weird irony that they want more control and yet give less money. And then finally, I got to know about audit culture and the name for this. Basically applying these new public management techniques, and throughout the public sector especially, we're audited to death, whether it's standardized testing in K-12 or now increasingly in universities. Only certain ways of disseminating knowledge counts, only certain knowledges count. And I thought that would be good. I thought, okay, well, now I know these things and I can see how they affect my own performance and my colleagues' performance, and once we know we can change it though I was reminded by many other colleagues that even if we got rid of those things, there wasn't a golden time for everybody at the university, that many voices were excluded, even if you expanded the 60s civil liberties movement within the university and made it more inclusive. It still is racial statecraft and military statecraft, and so there are still issues with the fundamental sort of core of the university, even if you add these other things and make it more inclusive. And I guess that's what led to the book. I put a call out to find scholars around the world, and they answered, to my surprise, and came to Regina, Saskatchewan.
In the summer.
In the summer, in July, in this small little prairie town that no one's ever heard of, that people know and like the name because it rhymes, obviously, with other parts that Dr. Ruth could probably explain better than me.
Rhymes with clitoris.
To get Seinfeld.
Dolores.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's it, and those who couldn't come physically for whatever reason agreed to do Skype interviews with me and recorded it, and they all agreed to be in the book. The book is available for purchase online and through NYU Press, but it's also available for free. You can download the PDF, and I encourage you to do that. You don't need to spend your money. None of us get any money for it. It's the condition we went with U of R Press was that they would make it open access for everybody, no conditions, and we've done that. So thank you for letting me explain the book and for telling my story and for being here.
Thank you.
I want to go last.
Am I in charge?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm in charge. Sandy, would you like to start? Ruth, who wants to talk? Go ahead.
It's just nice to always gather here and sort of your house, I kind of feel, and clearly on Lenape land. So thanks for folks for coming out. I'm just off from the spectacular graduation ceremonies at my institution at Connecticut College, and then also here at Columbia University. And this is just, and I should introduce myself, I'm sorry, I'm Sadie Grande. I teach education at Connecticut College. What else about me? I identify as Quechua. You'll learn other stuff about me, I guess. And so in that space of graduation, was reminded many times throughout, at least in my own head, I kept thinking of our elders and ancestors upon which, called into that space in lots of different ways, both in terms of how they were ignored and both in terms of how they were acknowledged. So I certainly want to acknowledge the elders and ancestors in this space and who came before, and Dr. Ruth, it's a pleasure and honor to have you with us tonight. So thank you so much for all the work you've done. And to Mark, to say twice you've gathered us in ways that there's a handful of people I would have made time for during this crazy week. And by a handful, I mean like one handful, probably. And Mark, it's certainly, you're one of those people. And I want to say that's primarily because, and a lot of what I'll be talking about tonight, just briefly, is relationality. And while I've done, a few projects, I have to say the whole process, Mark, throughout the whole process, you affirmed and grounded everything through relationality, through really good ethics and relations, and so that's why we're here in the text, and that's why we're here tonight, and that's all too rare in the academy, I think, so I definitely want to mention that. So the piece that I wrote is called Refusing the University, written from, I think, a critical indigenous perspective. And there's a quote I usually like to begin with that's actually from Glenn Couthard's book, Red Skin, White Masks. No. Yes. Did I get that right? I'm so tired. Yeah, Red Skins, White Masks. It's either the other way around. But that is, for indigenous peoples to live, capitalism must die. And and the text is really kind of about an analysis of some of the structures, Mark, that you mentioned as it applied to the university, but in relation to governance. And so I often use that kind of quote in my talks. And there's sometimes, if not often, questions about, well, what can we do? And so I sort of talk in the end and a little bit in the chapter of like, how do we counter sort of the logics of capital? And Leanne Simpson, another Anishinaabe scholar, talks about how the opposite of dispossession, which Indigenous peoples talk a lot about dispossession and the structures of dispossession as related to capital, is not possession. So in other words, the political project is not for Indigenous peoples to go out and repossess on some level. We love our land back, but it's really about relationality. And that's the really counter logic to capitalist logic. So especially across these days when you see these grand celebrations, and there should absolutely be celebrations for the work that lots of young people have done in the academy. But it's much more than that to me, and so I've been thinking quite a bit of what does it mean to be anti-capitalist in academic spaces or as a pedagogy, as a logic. And so I start on my phone just keeping a running list for myself, and as it strikes me, I just kind of add it in about what it means to be against capitalism. So I'm just going to read this very short list, and hopefully it's something that we can have some conversation around, because I'm just continuing to think it through. So to be against capitalism, or against capitalist logics really, I think, is to be against fast, or certain, I don't even know if against is the right word, but certainly a counterfactual, or something that we're aware of on some level, or things that we call into question. So the things that, for me, that get called into question are what is fast, what is young, or probably youth obsessed, what is individualist, what is new, what is secular, winning, extraction, appropriation, accumulation, hoarding, ownership, property, desire, triumphalism, the psychologization of things, meritocracy, branding, consuming, self-promotion, bragging and humble bragging, virtue signaling, ends and not means, and even inclusion. And I can keep going, but I think I'll just end there because those are often things, especially when we work in the academy, that I think are harder to remain conscious of sometimes, as opposed to just sort of being anti-capitalist in this kind of structural way in terms of the political economy. But all of these things, I think, lead to a logic that seep into our minds, into our practices, into our relations. What it means to be really grounded in relation means, to not let this be transactional either. And I see that quite a bit in the academy. Cultivating of transactional relationships, and that's not the cultivation of relationships that we need. So anyway, I started saying, like, I often get this question, what can we do? And then I often say we need to kind of build our relations. And then recently somebody said, well, is that all we can do? And I thought, that's a lot, actually. If you're building good relations, think about those of you that might be in relationships, and you've certainly studied this for your whole life, Dr. Westheimer, but relationships are hard. They're really challenging to be in good relation with somebody, and to have good relatives is another way we might talk about it, is really, really hard work. And so I think, yes, that is kind of enough. That's a lot to ask for, just that right there. And to be mindful of these other kinds of things, of what it means to foreground relationships as opposed to your own individual kind of project, or your own individual self, or your own individual accomplishments, or, it's so much a part of the academy that I think it's something you have to keep in mind almost all the time, and you'll still fail at it every day. And fail, as opposed to winning in here, I think failing and failure is something I've also been thinking quite a bit about, and how generative it is to lose, how generative it is to fail, how generative all those spaces really are, that we kind of have more and more kind of exercised from our learning spaces, and that worries me.
Thank you.
Do you want me to go? Yeah.
Go. only because your mom's here. So let me begin with 2 preface comments, and then I'm going to read a little from a diary that I had a few years ago. So one is really about Mark, and Mark, so we'll just make you cry and embarrass you, but Mark has been asking the question, to whom is the Academy accountable? And it's a big question, and Steve's been asking that question. Like, CUNY is this quirky, crazy place. It's a Gloria Anzaldúa, borderland where it's both liberatory and oppressive. And Jihan and I and Joan Scott and Tony Alessandro have been trying to write about a manifesto for the just university at a time where the NYPD has been called in to monitor Muslim students associations, or older Jewish faculty have shut down younger Jewish faculty who are speaking about a variety of issues about occupied territories. So those dynamics are CUNY. And it is in the soul of CUNY to keep those conversations going and not let anybody win or prevail or shut down, and yet we're trying to craft a piece to the new chancellor to say, hold that soul, please, because the neoliberal capitalist train of white supremacy is trying to eat us in a very particular way. And so I feel like, Mark, you're this guy, I don't even know who you are. Like, you're this guy I love and I don't even know, who feels like you could be my son out in Saskatchewan, and he invites us out there, and he invites mostly indigenous scholars, a white guy in the middle of Saskatchewan, because he wants to mark the moment when the boarding school's TRC reports come forward. He wants to invite folks who are thinking about K through 12 but higher ed. He invites the dean of the law school, who says, oh my God, we have to shift everything because we've been teaching settler colonial logics in intellectual property law and individual rights and torts, and we need to work. And that you dared to do that, and that wasn't easy. And there were fights within about people who were invited, who said they were indigenous and weren't, and did blah, blah, blah. We're all in that, but you held all of that. And this book holds that soul and those ideas, and I think we're all very appreciative that you held that, and you modeled for us what's it like to not back out as the white guy or the white woman and say, well, this isn't my fight, but to hold the space that could engage the contradictions and still produce a text that says the university is worth fighting for. And so for that, I thank you. Dr. Ruth, I didn't know you were coming, but I'm so glad you are here, because you have modeled for me as a little girl, and now as a grown-up, not so little girl, the capacity and the audacious commitment to speak aloud the secrets that a culture has, and that if someone breaks the silence, it frees everybody. And you were willing to be that woman. Someday we will find out, maybe tonight, like what enabled you to be that woman. But my mother, who physically resembles you, but didn't have the courage. So she had headaches and laid in bed and held the sadness. And you took that and moved it out. And I feel like, I don't know if you know what a model you were for little girls who didn't know you could speak things out loud.
That's right.
Right? And it's just, I'm about to go give the commencement speech at Stanford, where Christine Blasey Ford is. And she did the same. She did another version of that. She's your daughter. Like, she broke the silence, and she didn't want to. You wanted to. Like, she just had to. And the power, like if words had wings or shoes or dancing, that you did that. And again, this book does that. So I imagine Mark and Dr. Ruth having a baby, and that's this book.
Joel might not.
Wait, I'm hearing a lot of like consent language, okay? So my piece in this book, and I'll read you a little of it, but not much. My piece reflects on, and it's called Accumulation, Marking Capitalism, and it's discontents, as in Marx's discontents, but like what gets thrown to the side of the road when institutions get interested in accumulating power and money and whiteness. So, and no comparison between my life and the real lives that get thrown to the side of the road. But I will read a piece and then we can chat. Mid-November, I left the YMCA in Montclair, got into my car, checked my emails, and I saw an email from a lawyer at the Graduate Center. When can we talk? We've received a FOIA request for all of your emails. See attached. FOIA is Freedom of Information Act. It's really not really about freedom. Okay. My stomach dropped, as yours would, if you got that email, as I scrolled down. In some ways, I had been waiting for this. The last year and a half, I had been deeply embroiled in a parent union educator movement for social and racial justice in a small town in New Jersey, long known for progressive education politics, radical attempts to desegregate and educational innovation. 18 months ago, a Broad Foundation superintendent, kind of the embodiment of neoliberalism and privatization, showed up and all hell broke loose. For 2 years, parents linking arms with educators and the local union, which was led by courageous black women, had been asking questions, hard questions at board meeting. We were considered uncivil. At least it was uncivil for white people like me, who was supposed to be on the other side of privatization, to ask in a suburban community known to be progressive, even though half of the African American students in our strategically desegregated schools lived below the poverty line, we weren't supposed to ask hard questions about whether integration was working for everyone. The corporate folks dangled the tragedy of the achievement gap as their fig leaf to cover up their desire to make money in a town where everyone knew black pain was real. The administration, supported by a corporate majority board, had managed to cut all the supports for the most struggling students. Sorry if those of you from the UK are having flashbacks. They published erroneous data to the public, exaggerating how much their privatization scheme narrowed the racial achievement gaps. And they hired a number of underqualified chiefs, which is what they called them, straight out of the Broad, Gates, and Walmart playbook. Over the past 18 months, they had engaged in what they call at Harvard disruptive innovation. Find the weakest spot in the public sector where there is pain, exploit it, mobilize those folks, and then privatize the shit out of the system. The imposition of quarterly assessments on schools, hold teachers accountable for whether or not children are learning their letters, their colors, their numbers. A contagious chill of intimidation wound its way through the schools. There was an attempt to subpoena the IP addresses of anonymous bloggers. And there was an active subpoena, boy, I have forgotten this, sorry, hanging over the head of the one black male board member who spoke with integrity. And he was accused of being my voice. This is David Cummings. So there was an investigation about whether I was feeding David because he was challenging the board. And I just have to say that my father used to challenge my mother when she would challenge him and say, those aren't your ideas, those are Michelle's. So this idea of like putting my ideas in a less powerful or more powerful person's bodies, I became the lightning rod because I was the white Jew who was on the wrong side. In May 2012, the rabbi, who was the husband of the chair of the board, turned to me angrily and said, why didn't you just call us at home to discuss these issues? Why did you raise them in public? Civility for elites insists on dissent in private. Anything in public rises to incivility. A few months later, one of the locals who claimed that a million people in my town claimed to be Cory Booker's campaign manager. It's like this thing. I work for Cory Booker, I work for Hillary Clinton, and they were all privatizing schools. Took up the work for the superintendent. He pulled me aside after a board meeting in front of lots of people and said, you're a liar, I'm rich as fuck, and I'm gonna ruin you. So this was a very complicated time in my life. Within a few months, an anonymous blog appeared, a venomous online blog that ran anonymous clips of my friend Gail Shepard, the black woman who ran the union. They ran her 1989 tax records. Outrageous accusations about Ira Shore, another CUNY professor, and a parent who works for the AFT, and accusations the two African-American women who burst into the board meeting were Michelle Fine's lieutenants. And a position circled town calling for civility. I've really forgotten these details until I read this. I'm sorry, I'm a little sweaty. Our town is progressive, racially integrated, desegregated schools, gorgeous trees. But still fraught with enormous gaps, enormous gaps. We are the place where Chris Cerf, who started Edison Schools, lives, and then was appointed as the Commissioner of Education in Newark. We're the place where John Schnur lives, who Obama wanted to appoint as race to the top. We are a hotbed of Cory Booker Democrats. He shows up at synagogues all the time in our town. Okay, I won't bother you with the details. A lot of people in Montclair go into Newark to do good and do well. That's the language of the privatizers. To break things and move fast, that's also the language. To help those poor children who are dying in the public schools. And in the meantime, if they can close a black school, get rid of some black teachers and bust the union, not bad. Blah, 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 blah. In November 2014, an anonymous FOIA request arrived here at the Graduate Center detailing a call for all the emails between Michelle Fine and then it named 28 black and white and Latino, but mostly black educators and activists who were on our side. I'll skip all those horrible details. So when I got the email, I went upstairs and I said to Lynette Phillips, really, you're not really gonna get, you're not gonna give those emails to those people, are you? And she said, well, we're a public institution, we must. So I contacted my friends at the ACLU, who were, of course, magnificent, and contacted CUNY and said, you don't have to do that. It's not like her work, whatever, it's not blah, blah, blah. Anyway, CUNY handed over the emails, 1,000 of them. And I remember it was the night before one of our holiday parties, and I went upstairs and they had a glass of wine, and she showed me the emails that she was about to send to this privatizing organization that I knew was going to put them online. You could read all my emails if you want. It's called Montclair Schools Watch. They're all there. So 1,000, between me and 28 named people, most of whom were black, and union members and teachers. And it was confusing to me. And I said, these people wrote to me. They didn't know. This is a violation of their, forget me. It's a violation of their privacy. And what this institution said is, they know if they write to a public institution, it's public. And I'm like, I swear they don't know. They really don't. And you all hired me to be a public intellectual around education. It's not like I was selling Tupperware or lobbying, or, right? And the ACLU wrote to them and said, don't do it. Anyway, they did it. So one night, they did it. And they hung, and this group, Montclair Schools Watch, hung all of these online. And redacted some names, but you could still see through them. And they were looking for conspiracy, but what they found is that I curse a lot, but you all know that already. So I said things like, I don't know why, anybody raising sons? Like I said that, you'll love this, I said things like they're sucking our dicks. I don't know why I said that, but there it is in our email, and it's online. And they said things like, you know, I hate the fuckers, and there it is online. You know, fortunately, I then went to South Africa. Maria and other people started an international petition, and every night in South Africa, I would look on my phone and see, like, we love you, Michelle, the teachers of Malta. Or I offer this reflection because I think austerity and privatization of public institutions makes public universities more vulnerable to a set of privatizing and elite interests that they otherwise might resist. If I had remained at University of Pennsylvania, A, the lawsuit the FOIA wouldn't come because it's not public, and B, Penn would have thought they owned me. And so they would have protected me as their product. CUNY hung us out to dry. It has not affected my life at all, but it's a parable. It's a story about the vulnerability of public institutions. And I have to tell you, the night before they released the data, I wrote to Barbara Bowen, the head of the union, Milliken, and Chase Robinson, and Barbara was amazing and fought it and fought it and fought it. But the guys decided to hand it over. Chase said, because I used state machinery. That was not a pretty conversation. But what seemed important is that they took the position that because we're a public university, we must comply with freedom of information. Within a week, I went to a meeting at the NAACP because a group of us had been meeting to sue CUNY for denying access to black and brown kids to the four-year colleges because we hiked the SAT score to 500 in the 4 years. And one of the lawyers for the NAACP said, you know, I've been sending FOIAs to CUNY for the data, and they keep stonewalling me. So I had to send just one more slightly snotty email to Milliken and Chase and Barbara saying, you know, it's so funny, you told me you have to submit all the material when there's a FOIA. So when my ass was riding in the wind, you were more than willing to send the material, but when your ass was, you covered up. And so I think privatization and the kind of metric madness that Mark outlines and the forms of like aggressive capitalism that Sandy articulates, public universities are particularly vulnerable and unfortunately spineless. And it is up to us. I mean, the great thing about CUNY is that, no, we're like not doing that. And that we mobilize the CUNY, the people, not CUNY, the institution. And I think we can't rely on institutions. That feels like a sad thing to say at the age I'm at, but we can't rely on institutions to have courage. I'm about to give this talk where Christine Blasey Ford is on the faculty, and I have learned that the institution refused to write a letter for her to Congress. And yet I just received the letter that hundreds of faculty and students wrote for her, but they had to say as private citizens. Wow. So I think public universities are particularly vulnerable, but I think that we the people, whoever we are, need to like take that institution back and remember that it is people's and it needs to have the chutzpah of a Dr. Ruth and the heart of a Mark, because the institution's not going to speak for us. It will only betray. Enough.
Thanks, Michelle. That was fantastic. Yesterday, it seems like so long ago already, but I attended my niece's graduation at Columbia, so we were, I guess, at the same graduation. And President Bollinger, who has lots of controversy swirling around him, but I'm not going to talk about the controversy. I'm actually going to say something quite positive. The meat of his address was about the attack on knowledge. And I thought it was actually extremely appropriate that he talked about the place of a university education at a time when knowledge is under assault. And he talked about the historic ideal of a university as a place of democratic exchange and education in he didn't use these words, but I'll use them, in participatory democracy. I know there's lots of bad feelings about Bollinger here, but I'm just going to encapsulate that one little thing. And it struck me, when I was listening to him, that this attack on knowledge is, of course, taking place at a time when, the week, when we see, Georgia and Alabama passing laws that are ripped from the pages of The Handmaid's Tale. We see sex education curriculum being stripped from schools or modified based on false information about abstinence education and everything else. And of course, we have leadership that now no longer spins the truth, which we're all used to, but simply fabricates things. And so this idea of knowledge, not facts, but knowledge, at this central time seems crucially important. But there's another thing that's going on as well, which I'm going to talk about, which is what I study about, which is a time of diminishing commitments to democratic institutions in general, not just universities. And universities, of course, are heavily implicated in that. So some of you may know the study from the Harvard political scientist Yasha Munch and the Australian Stephen Foa that also came out in tandem with a Pew-funded study that found that in the United States, 22% of residents, of people in the United States, no longer feel that a strong leader, it would be good to have a strong leader who doesn't need to be accountable to legislation or to Congress in order to get things done, okay, 22%. And the Pew study stated it even better, thought that a political system in which a strong leader could make decisions without interference from Congress or the courts would be a good way of governing, okay? The Pew study was a worldwide study. They worked off the National Values Survey, and the global statistic for that is 26% of people who think that. But here's the particularly scary thing from where I come from, since I don't mean Canada, I mean as a civic educator, and where we all come from as educators, is that among US millennials, that figure was 48%. So 48% of US millennials feel that it would be okay to have a government where there was a strong leader that they liked, who didn't need to bother with Congress or the courts to get done what he or she wanted to get done. And so we're talking about this dissident knowledge in higher education at a time when we have not only diminishing support for universities and for the kinds of universities we want, but for a society-wide and indeed global phenomenon of a diminishing understanding in what liberal democracy is. And this is, of course, as Sandy points out and Mark points out and Michelle points out, a direct result of policies that some people call in the term that alienates other people, neoliberal, but does describe it, right, in neoliberal policies that don't always say exactly what they mean. And when I wrote this chapter, I talked about 5 different aspects of these developments: fictive austerity, accountability, attacks on critical thinking, attacks on faculty governance, and something I called the meritocracy myth. And of course, I'm not going to talk about all 5 of those now, but I do want to talk about 2 of them that have to do with the shifting of the central purpose of a university education, which historically, ideally, it was never an actual reality, but historically was about educating a democratic citizenry, right? People who were informed enough to be able to govern their own affairs. And in fact, public schooling in the United States was founded on those ideals. It's like, goes back to the Thomas Jefferson quote, if the people aren't well educated enough to govern their own affairs, then the solution is not to take that power of governance away from them and give them to an autocratic ruler, but to educate them, right? And universities have long had as at least a rhetorical goal, if not an actual one, of doing that. That's where land grant institutions come from. It's where all kinds of places like City College, like CUNY, and a lot of places around North America come from. And what's fascinating is, sure, we were always critical of that rhetoric not meeting the reality, but we no longer have that rhetoric, right? That rhetoric is gone. So what universities are now about is job training. We were never against job training. Of course, people should, emerge from school being able to make a living for themselves and support their family, but it had to be in conjunction with reflection on where we are as a society and where we're going, right? And an instilling of the responsibility of helping to steer that ship, right? In a totalitarian nation, no one's asked to help steer the ship. I mean, even a benevolent dictator, who has the people's best interests in mind, and is not squirreling money off to the Cayman Islands, still is not interested in what the people think, right? He or she has their own ideas. So, but in a democracy, we need people to be involved in looking critically at the world around them and making decisions about how to move forward. And 2 of the ways that this change is happening is one, of course, what I call in this chapter fictive austerity, which is basically the fictional narrative that we're all in this period of austerity. For the last 8 years, I've been doing this education segment on CBC Radio in Canada, and periodically, whatever I'm talking about, there's always like a caller or someone who writes in who asks a question that's more or less like this. So, Professor Westheimer, what do you think in this time of austerity, like what should we cut from schools to make ends meet in this time of austerity? And I always wonder, like, who declared this time of austerity? Was there some like ministerial order that I missed, right? We have like unprecedented wealth being generated in countries, lots of countries around the world, certainly in North America. It's how that wealth is distributed and what priorities we put those things towards. And so I'd rather the question not be, what should we cut from schools, right? But which programs should we support in order to give the best possible education and health and meaningful life to our children, right? And where that money should go. So the fictive austerity is one. The other, of course, which is near to Mark's heart, and in some ways Mark started us all thinking about these things, is the issue of accountability, which is, again, a play with language, because just like the austerity language makes everyone start with the idea that we are in a period of austerity, right? It doesn't, ask you to question that. It just starts from there. So it is with accountability, because you can't be against accountability, right? Like when someone says, well, who are you going to be accountable to? How do you talk back to that. Well, I don't want to be accountable to anyone, right? I just want to do whatever the hell I want. I mean, it's hard to talk back to that once you've started down this road of accountability. But accountability has its whole set of lies that go with it. One of which is that we actually know how to measure the things that we care about. Not just we in this room, but like that everybody cares about. When you ask parents what they want for their children, when they graduate from school, when they graduate from college, the top 3 reasons are not about career. They're about happiness, they're about love and relationships, and about meaningful participation, right? Career's in there, it's in the top 10 for sure. I want them to get a good job, but it's not the first thing that comes to our minds. So, but we don't know how to measure those things, right? So because we know how to measure certain things, we're very good at knowing whether people can add 2 + 2 and get 4. We're very good at knowing whether people can decode the words of a sentence and, and figure out its meaning. But we're less good at knowing whether people have learned how to be in a healthy relationship, or how to find meaning in their lives, or how to look up from their iPhone when they're walking down the street. And not trip over, someone else, right? Yeah, or how to think critically about the world around them, or how to participate effectively in democratic institutions. We're not that good at those things, and so what we start doing, you may have heard this before, but because we can't measure the things we care about, we start caring about the things we can measure. Because we're human beings, we love these numbers, right? If you're a parent and the newspaper publishes the rankings of the schools in your area, you're like, oh great, I don't have to visit the school. This school got a 9.2 and this school got an 8.7. So I'll send my kid to that, the 9.2 school. But what's hidden is that it's not that those numbers are meaningless, they mean something, but they're this little tiny, tiny piece of what goes on at school, right? Even within the subjects that are measured, math and literacy, for K-12 education, even within those, it's not like, I've never met a math teacher who said, oh yeah, the test, the standardized test, it measures everything I do in my classroom. I mean, it's terrific. No, like, teachers are doing a million things at once, right? And it's the same for us in the university. And when the university is narrowed to an institution that is about job training, everything that follows from that gets increasingly damaging. Well, if it's about job training, then why do we have to actually come here to do it? Why not do it from our kitchen, on our computers, right? If it's about credentialing, why do I need to take a whole semester to do it? I could do it in a weekend, right? And these are, of course, then the things that come to our universities and what happens to universities. In the process, things like faculty governance fall by the wayside because we're all too busy trying to collect data that we have to enter into programs that change every 5 seconds, and there's a lot of busy work that's taking up our time, and so things like faculty governance fall by the wayside, and things like meaningful assessments of what's going on fall by the wayside. And I'll end by just saying that this stuff, what drove me into this kind of work in both K-12 education and in higher education isn't just academic, it's quite personal for me. And it's personal not just because babies are being ripped from mother's arms down the road, or people are being pushed into being homeless, although that seems quite personal too. But this past summer I took a train from Frankfurt to Prague, and I was waiting in the Frankfurt train station, and I realized, and I hadn't realized this before, the exact dates, but I realized that it had been almost to the week, exactly 80 years since my mother stood on that very same train station in Frankfurt and said goodbye to her parents. She left on a kinder transport from Frankfurt and went to relative safety in Switzerland with 100 other children. My father also he was born in Karlsruhe. He left with his parents to Lisbon, to Portugal, when adults could still leave, and was a little more fortunate because his family survived, and he eventually came to the United States to study. But my mother said goodbye to her parents. She was 10 years old when she waved goodbye to her parents, and I, you know, it's strange, of course, because I'm so removed from that kind of pain. My life has been so privileged in that regard, but I wonder. There's obviously lots of things to blame, and we all know the causes of Nazism in Germany, and we're seeing them all right now. I mean, anti-immigrant othering of people, rampant and growing and accelerating economic inequality, and you know, maybe historians talk about the punishing defeat of Germany in World War I. But as an educator, I can't help thinking about what was civic education doing, right? And what could have been done differently in K-12 schools and in universities in Germany to make the outcome of that decade any different, right? And what are we doing now to prevent similar kind of blossoming of hate from happening now? And so I don't think there could be a more important time for a university education, and yet the one that my niece received, and the graduation that Sandy and I attended, and the one that you attended at Teachers College and are about to go to in Pennsylvania, is increasingly rarefied, right? Fewer and fewer kids are going to get an opportunity to get the kind of education that one gets at a Columbia. And I don't mean that the Columbia University education is necessarily better than many others, but simply the kind of education that one gets that's not specifically about job training only, right? That is about a reflective view of the world, a reflective way of looking at the world. One of Michelle and my close friends and one of my mentors, maybe Michelle's mentor too, who died a few years ago, Maxine Green, was a philosopher of education at Teachers College uptown. And she used to say, the purpose of education is to comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable. And I've always loved that because, of course, we need to create safe spaces in universities where people are comfortable and aren't bullied and so forth. But we also need to take very seriously the second part of that, which is we need to trouble the comfortable, which means everything that everyone said who spoke before me, which is that we need to have people think critically about what's going on and have the time and space to have the education that carries that kind of methodology with it. Mark, get back up here.
Coming up.
What do you think, Mark? Conversation?
Yeah, that'd be
Open
great.
Thoughts, questions, love? There is one back there, and you're on deck, so work on your question.
Oh, I know you saw me squirming, and I couldn't help but squirm as a student graduated from Teachers College, and would arguably say that that was not a reflective education. It was the opposite of that, but that's exactly what I think its job is. I love your piece, Refusing the University, and I love the working off of Robin D.G. Kelly's article in the Boston Review, Black Study by Struggle, when he's like, just troubling, do I want to belong? I think it's a beautiful thing to, especially so I mean for those of us who work with students and you know we always are like, yeah, get ready for college. I always question about what could critical mentorship look like if we actually, instead of trying to assimilate our students to fit into this college or to want to even belong into this college, if we use that as a powerful positionality of resistance. I don't want to belong to a university, and they don't want me to belong, and because its exact objective is to continue dispossessing my community, is to continue the profit off of murder, is to do all this. And so I really appreciate your article, and I'm so glad you're here because I can't help but think, was the public university ever for me or about me or my community? Who's really the public? What is democracy? Is that really just a euphemism for like white settler colonial governance? And I don't know, I have a lot of things to say, but I'm just like feeling a lot of tension here with regard to that, and just the idea of what public university is could be and should be, and whether or not the idea of the politics of recognition, if we can just transform that. And so I really appreciate your talk that we were talking about on Tuesday, when you use the idea of hospice. So maybe we could, since we didn't get to speak about that, what possibilities exist to facilitate in the hospicing of the university? Because I feel you, Mark, like that's what I'm dealing with right now as a doctoral student. I don't know if I want to even be here, but I also understand the power and privilege it allows me to be in spaces that my community members cannot be in, and some of them don't want to be in. So I'm just trying to figure out how can I facilitate the hospice. Yeah.
Sure. So I remember that moment in the conference. So in my piece, I talk a little bit about some of these ideas of but you're making me think, I don't want to lose my train of thought, but basically about, I understand the university and public education in general as an arm of the settler state, as never ever being anything about anything other than dispossession in multiple forms, and exclusion. And so in that moment, in the space where Mark had invited multiple kinds of people, I remember talking about the question of maybe the university needs to die, and again, thinking sort of about death as somebody who hospiced my mom 4 years ago, as a very generative space. And so, but just raising that question, and then I think it was shortly after my mom passed, and I said, it can happen lovingly, which I experienced hospicing as a very sort of loving, holding, helping to passage through. And then I know she's on the other side, so to speak, killing it, I'm sure. So it in that sense, it was a very intense but very deeply generative space. So I raised it sort of in that sense, but that created quite a bit of hostility from people who their identities, their work, their project, they saw very much as an extension of the university as such. So I continue to think about that. These are like, I'm much better at raising questions, and I think, than providing any kind of answers, so to speak. And lately, in a different presentation, I was thinking about the notion of ghosting, and I know ghosting in relationships, so somebody talks about their relationships, to kind of think about ghosting the university seems a little bit, because that's very, ghosting in relationships is not very, I don't know, it's the opposite of the kinds of relationships you have to have. But I also feel like, I think of this woman's work, gosh, what is her name? I know her last name is Flowers. But she talks about, another Indigenous woman talks about the productivity of rage. And so like, not all relationships are things to build upon. Some of them are just toxic. So what would it mean to, like, in hospices, again, this very loving space. So another question, this is just a question I asked myself, like, what would it mean for those of us who have always been outside of the university, who have, in a sense, refused it in many ways, as a generative act about one's own sovereignty, or the sovereignty of one's people, not really one's individual sovereignty. But what would it mean? And by ghosting the university, I sort of mean like, you do you kind of a thing, but like our thing is over here. Because it can take up, the toxicity of it, especially at this juncture, can take up so much of one's energy. It's an extractive relationship. other models are sort of Harney and Moten's notion of being in but not of the university. So, I mean, I think all of these are sort of models of relationality to think about. I don't know that any one is better than any other or worth kind of thinking through more deeply than any other, but there's certainly just modes that come to mind about our relationship to the university as such. Yeah, well, thank you for your questions, yeah.
Glad you raised that also, because one of the reviews of the book, one of the critiques was that it didn't have a conclusion. And the book doesn't have a conclusion on purpose. James and I discussed it several times and debated. And there really is this inherent tension between, is the university needs to be reborn and to die and rebuilt in some other form along sort of what I think Sandy and other, in this case in the book, Indigenous scholars have talked about, or does the university continue the civil rights movement progression and keep adding marginalized voices, but in the end not deal at the core? And we purposely left that up to the reader. You need to read the chapters, and there are 13 different slices of the core down the apple, and you have to decide what will be your entry point, where do you fit in, what's your relation to the university and your own work, your own local context, to decide what's the best path forward while protecting yourself, still making some form of progress. So that was it was deliberate. It wasn't an accident that we didn't have a conclusion. There's no conclusion to come to until you have to come to the conclusion. We can't provide it for you.
So there's so much, thank you everybody, it was really very insightful and thought-provoking. So a couple of things. One, I'm a delegate to the faculty staff union here, the professional staff conference. And one of the things I can say, the very, very slight silver lining in the dark cloud of Michelle's story is we all learned never to use university email again, any political work. So all union conversations now happen over Gmail, because they cannot do a Freedom of Information Act with your employing institution. I'm just saying that for everybody to be aware. If you're doing political work, that's the Chase Robinson argument that you're using state machinery, meaning a computer network. If you use, other forms of communication, they can't FOIA it. They can FOIA you individually, but they can't do it institutionally. So that's like the one tiny takeaway that was very positive from Michelle's awful